is nobody is paying attention to the underlying fundamentals and nobody understands how technologies get adopted in exponential waves. And Bitcoin's going to be adopted exponentially and it's going to shock people. And the numbers we're going to see aren't going to make any sense. And I just really think the Bitcoin scarcity, it's going to lead to some pretty crazy things. Okay. Like Bitcoin, like we said earlier, it has a $900 trillion TAM. I genuinely think it's going to be capturing half of the world's store of value assets. And I think it's going to happen much quicker than most people think. And when you really start to run the numbers and you're talking about $500 trillion of hypothetical demand for Bitcoin with a 6x multiplier effect where it is today, and that multiplier effect will become it'll become higher as Bitcoin is gobbled up and accumulated and hoarded by people like Michael Saylor who are going to hold it for 100 years. That multiplier effect is going to rise and shit's just going to get wild. Numbers aren't going to make sense. We're not talking about 5, 10, 20, $100 million per Bitcoin. We're talking about numbers much higher, okay? And again, all of the numbers that I like to talk about, I like to kind of say, look, this is today's purchasing power. When I say Bitcoin will easily be worth $100 million a coin much quicker than you think, I'm saying it's going to buy you 10 Malibu beach houses on the coastfront in California, okay? That's the purchasing power I expect. One of those puppies in California goes for about 10 million. This is like prime real estate, some of the best real estate you can get in the world. And I won't be parting with a significant amount of my Bitcoin until I can, buy 10 of those with a Bitcoin. Okay. That's, I believe, the end game for where Bitcoin is. And I think people just aren't paying attention. Not only, I think firstly, they don't understand money is a winner take all game. So just this idea of Bitcoin being just another asset and it just stopping at 50 or $100 trillion per coin, it's a stupid idea. CK Snarks says it the best. It's actually the least likely outcome that Bitcoin is just digital gold. And it's just at 500K, $1 million, it's $2 million. And it's just this thing that's a 1%, 2% allocation. CK has been screaming about this for years, and I have as well. Like, it is the least likely outcome. Bitcoin either captures the large majority of that $900 trillion of assets in the world, or it goes to zero and it dies. Bitcoin's a binary bet, okay? And it being at 500K or $1 million or 2 million, all of a sudden that unlocks a completely new realm of capital that can now allocate to Bitcoin in size, okay? 2 years ago, Microsoft couldn't even consider the possibility of putting some of their $100 billion of cash into Bitcoin when it was like a $200, $300 billion asset. They would have moved the market too much. But now the Bitcoin's a $2 trillion asset and on the way to being a $5, $10 trillion asset in the next 12 months, we see these new pools of capital unlocked. So I think that's the big idea. Bitcoin is a binary bet and technologies get adopted in exponential waves. Now, a related note is I believe everybody's measuring Bitcoin adoption wrong. So when most people say, okay, Luke, but you say we're in this like second era of Bitcoin. You say that things are starting to go exponential, but on an S curve, things don't start going exponential until you hit that 10% adoption rate. And people will correctly say adoption in normie world is like 1%, right? But this is because people are measuring adoption wrong. People are looking at Bitcoin being used as a medium exchange as adoption. They're saying, how many of my friends and family members go down to their local store and buy a coffee or a Monster with Bitcoin? And that is one form of adoption. And that is a very low form of adoption. Again, that's probably less than 1% globally, right? Even in El Salvador, maybe 10 or 20% of the shops in Bitcoin country are accepting Bitcoin as a medium exchange. But that's the wrong way to measure adoption, I believe. I believe there's two adoption curves that you need to be paying attention to in Bitcoin. The first is obviously medium exchange. How many people are buying coffee with Bitcoin? But then there's the second one that I think is more impactful for price, okay? And that is how many people are storing their value in Bitcoin. But more importantly, this is the monetization adoption curve of Bitcoin. What percentage of the people who control the majority of that $900 trillion of money in the world are adopting Bitcoin? This is the far more important one because this is Bitcoin's TAM, store of value asset, okay? Now, what percentage of those people are buying Bitcoin? Let me tell you, it's higher than 1%. And these are the people who matter. The people who control the $900 trillion, they're the people you should be paying attention to. And this is the big idea. Nobody's watching the adoption rates that we see across nation states, sovereign wealth funds, asset managers, corporations. They are the people who matter. They are the people who, in Michael Saylor's case, own 2% of the Bitcoin supply. There's 2,500 billionaires, and one billionaire already owns 2% of the Bitcoin supply. There's 58,000 public companies. One public company is squatting on 2% of the supply. Okay, just look at the world's largest asset managers. BlackRock. The beginning of today's show, we're talking about Charles Schwab, Fidelity, Goldman Sachs. If you look at the top 10 largest asset managers around the world, like 8 of them are like bullish on Bitcoin in a really big way. Okay, so what's that? 80% adoption? We are seeing 80% adoption in the industry that matters, in the realm that matters, the world's largest asset managers. What about sovereign wealth funds? 5 out of the 10 largest sovereign wealth funds are also buying Bitcoin. Qatar, the UAE has 2 really big sovereign wealth funds. There's 5 of them out of 10. What about pension funds? Some of the world's largest pension funds are buying Bitcoin. Japan, the world's largest pension fund with a $1.7 trillion pension fund, they came out a couple of months ago and they said, yeah, you know what? We are investigating Bitcoin for diversification strategies to hedge against the risk of the Japanese yen. This is coming from the world's largest pension fund in Japan, saying we don't want to hold our own currency. It's a shitcoin. We're looking at Bitcoin and gold as diversifications. So again, I believe the big idea is everybody's paying too much attention to medium of exchange adoption, and they're not paying attention to the hedge funds that control $5 trillion worth of assets. Okay, of the 25 largest hedge funds around the world, 60% of them own Bitcoin. 16 of the top 25 largest hedge funds in the world own Bitcoin. And 47% of all of the hedge funds, again, there's 15,000 hedge funds, own Bitcoin. Okay, these are the guys who matter. The hedge fund is a $5 trillion industry. Pay attention to that. Sovereign wealth funds control $50 trillion of capital. 50% of the largest sovereign wealth funds own Bitcoin. 50% adoption. What about the world's largest asset managers? Tens of trillions of dollars. Pay attention to these guys, not your mom or your dad or Auntie Jane or Bob, your uncle, who has $100 net worth and they're not using Bitcoin because they're too smart. Okay? Technologies are never adopted or driven by the masses. The masses do not matter. It's the visionaries. Henry Ford said in the early 1900s, if I had have asked the everyday person what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. They can't think outside of the current paradigm and think, maybe I'm going to invent an automobile. Or even when they see the automobile, they think, oh, it's boiling the oceans. It's dirty. It's so dangerous, right? Again, so the big idea is people are paying attention to the wrong data. And right now, we talked about it earlier in the show, the Bitcoin ETFs own 1 million coins in a year. Public companies hold 500,000 Bitcoin. And a lot of that buying has been in the past 12 to 18 months. If you simply extrapolate those trends out, not a lot of Bitcoin on exchanges in 4 years' time, baby. I actually think the exchanges are going to be drained in 4 years' time. We've seen over 1 million Bitcoin leave the exchanges since 2020. Again, 2020 was that inflection point where the first time in Bitcoin's life, coins started actually leaving the exchanges. Again, think about how significant that is. For 12 years, between 2008 and 2020, the coins or the number of Bitcoin on exchanges only grew. That's because people didn't understand Bitcoin. That's because the big boys weren't saying, hang on a minute, Bitcoin's an asset you buy, you take off the exchanges, and you never sell for 100 years, like Michael Saylor says. But for the past 4, nearly 5 years now, we've seen that trend change. We've seen 35% of all the available Bitcoin disappear off the exchanges. And they're just moving to the wallets of people who are not selling their Bitcoin, long-term holders. The amount of Bitcoin held by long-term holders is at all-time high. That was a long rant. I do this a lot.
A lot to unpack there. I don't know where to go from there.